All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Gary Garcia. He's a retired professor of livestock science from the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at UWI St. Augustine. He's also a trained ruminant nutritionist. He obtained his Ph.D. from UWI in 1988 and has taught animal production in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture and the School of Veterinary Medicine from 1990 to 2019. And he began his research in neotropical animal wildlife in 1992 at the encouragement of 5 undergraduate students. He has developed, in association with Dr. Keith Archibald, the concept and philosophy of the Open Tropical Forage Animal Production Laboratory and the Open School of Tropical Animal Science and Production. He has also helped with the development of the MSc in Tropical Animal Science and Production, and this program has been ongoing since 1995. He started a series on wildlife farmers and producers booklets, and he's in the process now of developing an electronic journal of neotropical animal wildlife. So that's just a brief introduction to Professor Gary Garcia. So the floor is all yours now.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. The title of my presentation is Learning About Animals, the Fauna of Trinidad and Tobago. And this presentation is made to the Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club. Okay, second slide. Bienvenido, bienvenido, bienvenue, and welcome to all. The objectives of this presentation is to first thank the Field Naturalist Club for inviting me, and they have been documenting the flora and fauna for the last 100 years. To give a brief outline of the fauna or native animals of Trinidad and Tobago, and to introduce you to the term neotropical, non-domestic animals instead of wildlife. Further objectives to present to you my perspectives on neotropical animal conservation, production, utilization, and health. To highlight some of our accomplishments, and to inform you about the collaboration that we have had with South American workers with Amazonian or neotropical animals. Next slide. Before I thank the Field Naturalist Club, I must have informed you that my background has been in agriculture, and I will give you an agricultural perspective. I must also thank the Field Naturalist Club as their original initiative began even before there was any institution of higher education in the English-speaking Caribbean. Next slide. The Field Naturalist Club began in 1891, and the first institution of higher education in the English-speaking Caribbean began in 1921. ICTA, the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, which is the forerunner of the Faculty of Agriculture. And the Field Naturalist Club laid the foundations for zoological and botanical information, as well as initiatives in the disciplines of zoology and botany of the University College of the West Indies and the University of the West Indies from their inception to the present time, which is basically 131 years. The fauna of Trinidad and Tobago, terrestrial and aquatic species. We have 43 species of fish, 33 species of amphibian, 47 species of snake, 44 in Trinidad and 21 in Tobago. A lot of this work was really done by Mr. Hans Boos. We have 28 species of lizards, and we have 2 species of two-headed snakes or worm lizards. There are 11 species of reptiles, and we have included, well, based on what I've gotten, we have 4 species of sea turtles, as well as the leatherback turtle, which is also a sea turtle. We have 2 species of alligators, one in Trinidad and one in Tobago. In the one in Tobago is considered one of the smallest species of crocodiles. Next slide. We have 96 species of mammals within 8 orders. We have about 430 species of birds spanning 5 orders and 67 families. Invertebrates and insects, I'm not too sure, but I think we have about 600 species of butterflies and about 2,500 species of moths. The source of this information is from the website Trinidad and Tobago Biodiversity, as well as some other literature that I had. Next slide. What can I say? An hour alone could be spent on the elaboration of the previous 4 slides. What statement could be made? Trinidad and Tobago is biodiversity rich. Wow. No other country in the Caribbean is so biodiversity wealthy. This is because Trinidad and Tobago is part of South America. But of what use is our biodiversity to us if it cannot benefit the national environment and community? I shall now like to share with you how I think we should approach biodiversity in terms of conservation, production, utilization, and health. In that biodiversity conservation cannot be dealt with in a silo, but it has to be linked to these 3 other disciplines. In addition, I should like to present to you an understanding of our positioning with respect to neotropical fauna and my perspective on our animal biodiversity as someone from agriculture. Next slide. Where is the neotropics? The neotropics basically is presented in this slide. And as you can see, Trinidad and Tobago, more or less, is in the center of the neotropics or New World. Next slide. The neotropics or neotropical zone is one of the world's 8 terrestrial ecozones. It includes South and Central America, the Mexican lowlands, the Caribbean islands, and southern Florida. It contains a large number of plant and animal groups. It is sometimes used as a synonym for the tropical area of South America. Next slide. This is one of my creative works. I call it the Picasso agouti, showing you how the agouti is from a tropical environment and it eats fruits. It was considered a frugivore, but work done by Kegan, Jones, and myself has proven that it is an omnivore and not a frugivore. So this drawing was done before that discovery. So that shows how dynamic our work is. Next slide. Why are we using the term neotropical animals and not wildlife or wild animals? Next slide. Wildlife includes all that has not been domesticated by humans, and this includes both plant and animals. But we use wildlife to mean terrestrial, but wildlife in its strict sense means terrestrial and aquatic, non-domestic animals. It is suggested that we should begin to use the term neotropical animals instead of wildlife because neotropical wildlife or Amazonian wildlife is much different to the wildlife found in other parts of the world. The wildlife found in other parts of the world, we tend to see on the media focusing on large mammals and megafauna like elephants, etc. Next slide. A man called Ojasti, who worked all his life in Venezuela, but was trained in Europe and USA before going to work in Venezuela. He published something in the FAO Conservation Guide 24 back in 1996. And he said most of the information now available, and that's quite some time ago, is descriptive or anecdotal based on the experiences, views, or beliefs of hunters and campesinos, and not on naturalist accounts of observations of animals in captivity and so forth. The diffuse information is repeatedly cited, but there is no way to check its origin and accuracy. Next slide. The problem with Latin American wildlife requires its own solutions, geared to the specific realities of the countries, the region, and the type of user. The above suggestion was made to ensure that we differentiate the approaches being developed for Latin American solutions to wildlife management, that is neotropical animals, from the North American and Eurocentric standpoint. So we have to have our own approach because we live in Latin America in a multiplicity of political, economic, sociological, and geographic systems. Next slide. Professor Williams, Emeritus Professor Williams, indicated that horses and camels had their center of origin within the Americas, but had become extinct for reasons unknown. And before Columbus, the natives of the Caribbean had no shortage of animal protein. So this means that the native peoples of the Caribbean before the arrival of Columbus, over 500 years ago, had access to much animal protein. But today, we in the Caribbean are net importers of animal protein for human consumption. This we must address. Only 5 of the modern-day domesticated animals are from the neotropics. They are the turkey, the Muscovy duck, which is native to Trinidad, but we now import it for production and food. The guinea pig, domesticated by the Incas 7,000 years ago, and it's the second most consumed animal protein in Peru. Chinchillas and the South American camelids, which are all one species, but they go by different names. Next slide. This is a picture showing the location of the turkey in southern USA and Mexico, the Muscovy duck in northern South America, the chinchillas and guinea pigs, western South America, and the camelids of the Andes and west and southwest of South America. Next. A picture of guinea pigs. Next. Muscovy ducks as we know it in Trinidad. However, you would see white Muscovy ducks which were bred in Europe and we import into Trinidad now. All these animal species and groupings were imported into the New World. All the modern day domesticated animals, dogs, cats, dairy and beef cattle, sheep, goats, rabbits, chickens, pigs, horses, donkeys, and even honeybees. Next slide. The neotropical animals. Within the neotropics, we have greater than 25% of all known world mammals, 33% of all birds of the world, 19% of world reptiles, and about 46% of the world amphibians. This was taken from Ojasti in 1996. Next slide, please. My perspective on neotropical animal conservation, production, utilization, and health. We have had a lot of missing information on Amazonian flora and fauna. And the Eurocentric and North American impressionism and over-dramatization about the Amazon has stimulated interest in neotropics in a very emotive way through advertisements and dramatic news flashes. This, however, has not been complemented with research funding for the expansion of the knowledge of the Amazonian flora and fauna. Next slide. In the 1990s, when I started this work, we did not know much about the important neotropical animals, wildlife species that were important to Trinidad and Tobago, more importantly. We still do not know much about their anatomy and physiology. We did not know much about their digestive system and their nutrient needs, and we did not know much about their reproductive systems and how to predictably get them to reproduce in captivity. Because if we cannot get them to reproduce in captivity, we cannot ensure their conservation. Next slide. The problem we encountered was that zoologists, agricultural scientists, and conservationists were all trying to communicate with each other, but were speaking different languages and pursued different approaches. So, next slide. To overcome this, we developed the concept of the Open School of Tropical Animal Science and Production. And this was documented in the proceedings of the Caribbean Food Crop Society in 2001. Next slide. Within this document was given the concept for developing an animal production system for any species. And the philosophy of the Open School of Tropical Animal Science and Production and the concept above could be the subject of another presentation. And you can find the paper in the next slide. You could Google it, and the Caribbean Food Crop Society had their proceedings published, and it's online. Next slide. What I shall follow next is what we know historically about neotropical animal production and what directions and successes the work of the Open School has taken. The Open School is now an adult, as it is now 21 years old since I published the concept. Next slide. The historical concept. Next slide. I shall now like to share with you the following from an exhibit on the history of zoos at the Pretoria Zoo in South Africa. And this next slide shows Montezuma and some Aztec background. And the next slide is a quotation from, I believe it was Bartolomé de las Casas, when he said, in 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan. He was astounded by the exceptional zoo kept by Montezuma II, the king of the Mexican Aztecs. The large number of carnivores and raptors ate 500 turkeys a day. So it means that they had to have some system for turkey production back then. He also kept a large variety of Central American birds. There were 10 ponds for waterfowl, enclosures for llamas, vicuñas, and deer, and an assortment of reptiles. The collection was so large that Montezuma employed 300 staff caring for these animals daily. Next slide. But what we found was that there were conflicts between the private versus the public sector interests with respect to our animal wildlife. There were conflicts between in situ and ex situ conservationists. And we found that there was little knowledge of the animals themselves. There was a lack of females, a lack of technical information production, and no government support. So that these were the problems with respect to developing intensive neotropical animal production systems. But we overcame it. Next slide. We also found that there was a lack of institutional support for neotropical animal wildlife, lack of funding, and very negative attitudes of the scientific, Eurocentric, and North Atlantic focused colleagues and institutions. But we persisted. Next slide. Our experiences in expanding this philosophy. Next slide. This is a picture of Roxanne Brown-Oldenburg, my first MPhil student who started the work with Daisy Proctor Leporinia. Next slide. This was what the early agouti unit looked like. Next slide. And in 2001, my students and I, we built the unit with our own hands. And here we have Dr. William Martin Molino, back, who was my first PhD student, Mr. Anil Rupchan, MSc with me, Mr. Zamid Jumanali, who did his MSc and MPhil with me with agouti. He graduates this year with his MPhil. Next slide. We see here the black-rumped agouti, which in the literature is called Dasyprocta mexicana, but it is still the agouti, Dasyprocta leporina. So we have the black-rumped agouti, we see the classical Dasyprocta leporina or the red-rumped agouti, and then we see a colony of agouti I developed that is completely white or white and brown. Next slide. And as you can see, one of their fruits of choice, or one of their foods of choice, is cassava. That is why when we have bans on hunting in Trinidad, as we had in a period for about 2 or 3 years, the people who suffered the most were the cassava farmers, because the agouti population was not kept in check. And they went and they ate the cassava tubers subterraneously. So when farmers thought they had crops in the ground, when they went to harvest, they found nothing. So this is why conservation and management must be linked to some sort of animal extraction as well as animal reproduction in an organized way. Next slide. From whom did I get my original information? From the traditional hunters. On the left-hand picture, the hunter in the middle, Douglas Sylvester Binder, lived in the forest for about 50 years. And he shared all the information he had with me on agouti, which was not in the literature. And then on the right-hand side, we have retired Army Sergeant Anthony Garcia, who shared all his knowledge with me on snakes and animals in the bush. And they helped me to get a better perspective and understanding of the need to have some sort of equilibrium between humans and native animals. Next slide. From an administrative standpoint, another publication indicated that hunting from an administrative and legal standpoint are 5 kinds: subsistence hunting, hunting for sport, commercial hunting, hunting for scientific purposes, and culling pest species. And hunting or wildlife, the value of wildlife from a global perspective is of economic importance, nutritional value, ecological role, and socio-ecological or socio-cultural significance. Source Chardonnay et al. You could find it on the internet. Next slide. They estimated that the total expenditure on all wildlife-related activities in the US in the 1990s was about $101 billion US. These types of records are not available within the neotropics very easily. But as we can see, there is value in wildlife, but even our neotropical animals, but we have to come about with some equilibrium between humans and animals and ecology. Next slide. I estimated back in 2000 that we extracted 90,000 agouti, 8,415 deer, and 1466 quenk, which had a street value of $27,881,000 TT. That was 22 years ago. It's a lot more valuable now. From that, I estimated, next slide, that these 90,000 agouti could be produced annually on about 100 farming units. The deer could be produced on 20 farming units, and the quenk could be produced on another 20 farming units. Therefore, on 140 farming units, we could at least produce these animals. And this is why we work towards developing intensive production models for these species. Some of the Trinidad and Tobago neotropical animal species with the potential for production or semi-domestication: the capybara, the lap, the agouti. Guinea pigs have already been domesticated and they eat grass. Reptiles, iguana, red-tailed boa, spectacled caiman. Next slide. The capybara is a very interesting animal. There may be arguments that they're not native to Trinidad, but we are so close to Venezuela that we have always had capybara. And right now, the capybara is being considered a pest. But the nice thing about the capybara is that it is ideally suited to our environment. And it's like a cross between a sheep and a pig. It can give you up to 8 in a litter, and it eats grass. It's a hindgut fermenter, and it lives under inundated aquatic conditions, which is not suited to any other of our domestic animals, with the exception of the Muscovy duck. Next slide. This is a little picture of a capybara farm in Peru. And as you can see, it has a pond with aquatic weeds. And this is a picture of the capybara colony at the Caracas Zoo. And look how nice they look. Next slide. We're supposed to have one of the largest groups of lap in Trinidad. These lap grow to about 20 kilograms. Next slide. These are all the different agouti colomorphs that I've had in the colony. And it proves the point that we don't have 11 species of Daisy proctor, but in fact, we may have at most 2 species, because all the species of Daisy proctor that are referred to as different types of species are really colomorphs, and it have to do with the coloration in their pelage. Next slide. Green iguana. Next slide. The iguana in the Mayan culture is considered the symbol of heaven. And the iguana is a true herbivore, but it will eat eggs if there's nothing else available. Next slide. We also can produce felines such as the ocelot, and I've known people who got the ocelot to breed in captivity and give up to 4 kittens per parturition. We have the armadillo, we have the anteaters, and we have the sloths. And the sloths are somewhat endangered. We call them pomewa. The colored peccary is one that can be semi-domesticated almost immediately. And I'm showing you some pictures here of a farm in Bahia, Brazil. Nobody in Trinidad could do that, hand feed a colored peccary, because these animals are very aggressive, but they can be domesticated. Next slide. The farm was about 4 hectares or 5 hectares and had about 450 peccaries and ate all sorts of fruits and forages. The peccary is somewhat, it looks like a pig, but it's not a pig. It has 4 stomachs and it can eat fiber. And this gentleman in Brazil, next slide, he developed the housing system for his peccaries to be able to move them and handling them along the same lines as the type of housing that we develop for cattle, sheep, and goat. Next slide. Well, you couldn't do this in Trinidad because the peccaries, they move in colonies and they will run you down and bite you. And they are known to disembowel hunting dogs because they have 2 pairs of canines. Manikou, the nicest meat, but the animal lives in some very, very unsanitary conditions. It has very good immune system, and it can, no, that's good. And it can withstand the bites of venomous snakes of many types. Next slide. The deer, Mazama americana. One of my PhD students is working with this, and she spent a month at the Surveyed Research Center in the University of São Paulo in Brazil a few years ago, before the COVID. Next slide. These are some of the avian species that we could produce under intensive systems of production. We have 16 species of wild ducks, and definitely one wild duck has already been very well domesticated over the last 100 years, the Muscovy duck, which the French took from Trinidad and French Guiana, and they worked with it, and they now have all the genetic material that they need. The Paui is one species that we can definitely breed in captivity. Okay, we can see, next slide, a colony of coquelicot. And the coquelicot is a galliform, like the turkey and the paui and the chickens, and their breasts consist about 40 to 45% of the entire animal's carcass. And it's an animal that is very worthy of domestication. They have, however, become a pest in Tobago. But this is where you can convert a pest into an asset. Next slide. The paui. It's critically endangered in Trinidad, and my statement repeatedly have been, let us set up some paui colonies in captivity and breed them and develop the colonies so that we can have animals to repopulate the wild. Because if we don't have that, within the next 5 to 10 years, we will have no more paui in Trinidad. Next slide. Some work looking at the nutritive value of the animals, comparing it to the rabbit. So we have the rabbit, second from left. We have the manikou, extreme left. We have the agouti, and we have the chicken. And we have the crude protein and fat contents of the agouti and the peccary. As you can see, the crude protein content is no different to the chicken. However, the chicken has very high fat contents. This is an example of the 4/4 of a peccary carcass from French Guiana, and looks very similar to the legs of pigs. Here is peccary cuisine, fricassé de peccary chez ma cuisine in French Guiana. And in the middle of the picture, we have Dr. Gail Young, because she spent 3 years doing her PhD work in French Guiana at the expense of the French government. We got no support, or very, 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 very little support from the local government. Next slide. This is a ticket for a wild meat queue. This was back in the early 2000, and yes, 2004. And you see the different types of animal meat that they have at these wild meat queues. Next slide. Some of our work with neotropical animal conservation, production, utilization, scientific work. We have produced a book on the agouti, guiding you of methods, but this was in 2004. And since 2004 now, we have done tremendous more work. This was a response to a request from the Republic of France to our unit. And in the southwestern corner, or the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a picture of a pen, a cage, with ducks over a pond. This is technology that we developed in Trinidad at the Sugarcane Feed Center, with the ducks over Cascadoo. And this was adopted, it was a technology adopted by the French government in French Guiana. And that was technology developed in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm proud of that because I was part of the development of that technology at the Sugarcane Feed Center. Next slide. This is the book, the manual on the production of the peccary. And you can see all the institutions that collaborated on it. And these institutions collaborated spoke Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese. Next slide. I must say though, that we produced a book that's online, The National Birds of Trinidad and Tobago and an Endangered Bird. This endangered bird is the Pawi, and you can download this 400-page volume and you will get a very, very comprehensive statement on the Pawi and how it could be reared intensively, as well as the cocorico and the hummingbirds. Next slide. You would see me presenting the book of the colored peccary to a Frenchman, and the book is in English. So how could a Frenchman benefit from it? Well, the book is so full of graphics that it is very easy to read and understand because it has shared graphical experiences from French Guiana, Suriname, Brazil, and Peru. Our PhD thesis, Dr. William Martin Molino, my first PhD student, features of the reproductive system of the male agouti, a neotropical rodent with the potential for domestication. He actually characterized the male reproductive system of the agouti, from the penis anatomy to the ejaculatory techniques to the evaluation of the spermatozoa. Next slide. My second PhD thesis was Dr. Gail Young, and it was basically a case study on international collaboration for livestock development using the peccary as the neotropical animal, and we conceptualize a production model for it. Next slide. The black-headed opossum, the third PhD thesis, Dr. Laura Tadier, and she basically conceptualized and proved an intensive production model for the manikou, the first time that this was done in the world. And the manikou is the most popular neotropical animal because it is found from southern USA all the way down to Argentina. Let us focus on this slide a bit. The production model is based on the management of the housing system. On the left-hand side, you see the cages for the female. And there is a cage that the cages can be opened on the left and on the right. And on the right-hand side, it's the one male cage. It's like a corridor. Male and female manicouls only come together when the female is in estrus. And therefore, the entire reproduction system had to revolve around the housing design. And this was very successful, and we predictably produced an intensive production model for this animal. And all the papers have been published. Next slide. Next thesis, Dr. Kegan Romelle Jones, an investigation into the presence of internal parasites and the effects on the agouti, a neotropical rodent with the potential for domestication. And he showed that the internal parasites, although they were present, they had no effect on the young agouti, the agouti in the fetus, and the agouti in the female. And he also looked at the growth, back, slide before. And he also looked at the growth of the agouti for about 10 or 12 months. And the parasites had no effect on them. And the carcass composition. So he looked at the reproduction, the growth, and the carcass composition of the animal. So this was a multidisciplinary study. And for that, he got his PhD this year. Finally, we have, next slide. We have the thesis of Dr. Stacy Marie Syme, Neotropical Animal Wildlife Production Models, and User Experience Design Knowledge e-portal. Well, as I mentioned to you, knowledge in the 1990s on our neotropical animals were very limited. But what this portal attempted to do was to pull together as much information as we can on our almost 50 species of neotropical animals. And it's online. And a very important suggestion coming out of this work was that our neotropical animals may be the best suited animals to deal with or adapt to climate change. And this is an example of the website that she first developed in 2004. And the next slide would show the present website. Because of the fact that there's so much negativity with respect to neotropical animals, the Open School of Neotropical Animal Science and Production website had to master visuals and architecture. And as a result, we also set the website in 5 languages, the 5 languages of neotropics: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. And it shows here the concepts of developing intensive animal production models that we have implicit in the website for the species, in which all the components of the model are identified. Next slide. This is how the e-compendium was structured. Next slide. And as you can see, with respect to the e-compendium, for these 50 or so neotropical animals, we had within the e-compendium for each animal something about their digestion, reproduction, health, housing, behavior, economics, conservation, what was unknown about them, legal and ethical status, climate change, and references. So this e-compendium now is a source of information online on at least 50 of our important neotropical animals or species grouping. Next slide. This is an example of the output e-compendium of the agouti. Next slide. So it's important that we understand the synergism between neotropical animal conservation, production, management, utilization, and health. So we have pictures that sort of represent that. So you can see why conservation cannot be kept in a silo. This is an example of what the domesticated guinea pigs in Peru look like today. They weigh about up to 7 pounds. And it is, next slide, it is part of the Peruvian cuisine. And they fry it with the head whole. And I've had the privilege of cooking, freeze a minute, I've had the privilege of cooking guinea pigs for Peruvian experts on guinea pigs in curry, sweet and sour, and jira, so that I gave them a culinary experience that they never had before with the guinea pigs. Next slide. This is a picture of when we went to collaborate with our South Americans to bring a conference to Trinidad in 2014. This here has all but 2 of my students, 2 South Americans in the picture, and the other 15 were my students who went with me to Argentina to bring the conference here. This is a history and the importance of the CIMFAUNA to Trinidad and Tobago and the higher education system. It started in 1992, and I first joined them in 2004 in Peru. Next slide. And as you can see, in 2014, we had it here in Trinidad. And that book on the national birds and an endangered book of Trinidad and Tobago was our gift to the conference. it was the feature. Was the logo of the Congreso Internacional sobre Manejo de Fauna Silvestre en la Amazonia y Latinoamericano, which is the expansion of the word SIMFAUNA. The objective of the SIMFAUNA we had in Trinidad was to explore the potential of neotropical animals with respect to conservation, production, management, and utilization. It included law, education, economics, and production as alternative sustainable conservation and utilization methods for the neotropics. And what we tried to do was to further establish our international networks for international collaboration initiatives with international multilingual and multicultural initiatives. Next slide. If we go back to that slide, to the former slide, I just want to make a point. I am so proud to know that I have been one of the workers very, very industriously working to develop collaboration with South America. And the fact that the website I developed has can be read in the 5 languages of Latin America. And that this academic year, for the first time, the University of the West Indies have seen it fit to include a foreign language to ensure that every graduate of the University of the West Indies in this cohort must be competent in a second language. I applaud the administration of the University of the West Indies for this initiative, but I must say they're about 20 years too late. Next slide. But better late than never. The significance of the conformer to Trinidad and Tobago. We were the first English-speaking country to host this conference, to explore the possibilities of neotropical animal biodiversity within a changing global environment, with specific implications for Trinidad and Tobago, and to solicit recommendations for best practices and laws. Next slide. Out of this conference, we formed 2 NGOs, the XI CIMFAUNA Conference 2014 NGO and Thompson's Conservation Center. These NGOs are in their embryonic state. And our NGO had our first big initiative before the COVID, in which Dr. Hugo Galvez from Iquitos, and who I consider my spiritual brother, from the Universidad Nacional de San Marcos, Lima, which is the oldest university in the New World, or the Western Hemisphere. It started in 1553. He presented to us at St. Augustine a lecture on neotropical primates. Dr. Galvez, and you would see he has his jersey with the logo of our NGO. I thank you for your attention, and my communication coordinates are on the slide. Thank you very much for having invited me.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, again, Professor, I want to thank you for taking the time to come out this afternoon and a very detailed presentation, very practical position to take on the agricultural sector and the need for self-sufficiency and sustainability in our agricultural sector. So thank you for your time again. And on behalf of the membership, we look forward to hearing from you again in the future, whenever you have any new information you want to give us. So with that, I want to thank everybody else for taking part in the meeting this afternoon. And that's it for tonight. Be safe, and we will see you all next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much.